Again. For those new to the channel or just in general my videos, my name is Jeremy. I'm doing another recording to fulfill my promise to create more content over the year, and this is my New Year's resolution. Today we're going to cover basically the changes from the last season of GHB to this new season of GHB. So basically, we're going to talk about um, both the mission deployments and so forth, and how they change from one GHB to the next, and how it's going to impact the game, but also how that impacts shooting, which is basically going to be, I think, the most impacted style play in Age of Sigmar. And for context, for folks once again who might not know me, my pedigree into this is I have basically played a lot of Kharadron Overlord in the last season. In fact, I'm not going to say I brought them back from the dead, but I definitely created a lot of buzz around them because they disappeared completely, almost entirely, when the new effectively 3.0 came out. And then during this last GHB, they kind of made a resurgence because battle tactics were more appropriate for them to score. And then from this edition to the next one, as well as getting asked about like how do I think KO will evolve in this new GHB and so forth. But I think the evolution isn't so much about KO, but about the entirety of the shooting army, and from this last GHB to this next. You'll see I'll explain, like, there's been a transition in the game in a way that really, I wouldn't say like it limits shooting, but there is a real like actual cost to deciding to bring a shooting army in the more traditional sense we've seen in the last few GHB, basically. So, without further ado, I'm going to talk first about the changes from the edition between the previous GHB and this GHB, and I'm going to start with basically visual, explaining like kind of simply the drastic changes from one to another. And sorry if this is kind of geeky for folks. This is kind of what I do for a living. I build business intelligence reports, and for a lot of decision makers, and I thought, like, why not take that to this channel as well for this exercise. So basically, I went ahead and mapped out all of the objectives across all of the different missions from the last GHB and then this GHB, and then basically also kind of mapped out like a value, try to associate a value point system to each objective placement on the board. And basically trying to indicate to the player what the relevance and importance of that objective is for the mission. So this is super lace of all effectively 11 missions, because we have one mission, Battleline's Drawn, which doesn't have any objectives. So we're just not going to talk about it between the two GHB. So you have 11 missions between the two GHB where objectives matter and they have a relevance on the board. And what the importance of drawing this out and mapping it is, it gives a context of like, what kind of armies do you want to bring to the table to play all 11 missions, right? Because what's important is not necessarily designing purely to the packet, but also figuring out an army that can kind of adjust based on the changes of the packet, right? If we're talking about people who want to bring an army that performs well in the entire circuit, not just one GT at a time, and how it's balanced for the overall like kind of meta environment. And so you'll notice that in this previous GHB, it seemed that the objectives, the mission, the name of the game was playing basically on the entire length of the center board, right? Like you'd have your deployment zone about 11 inches up from each long board. Obviously this doesn't explain deployment. This is just explains impact of objectives and where they are. So you kind of saw like there was kind of a very spread, diverse kind of value to objectives across all of them. And I should kind of explain, I forgot to explain how to calculate the value of the objectives. Basically, if you hold the objective for 6 turns, it will give you 6 points. That's the baseline kind of assumption I made. And then any mission that kind of gets you bonus points, I try to calculate it into that objective significance, as well as like if it's just arranged, kind of get the halfway point on that. It's not perfect, but it's at least gives you a context of like the size and importance of an objective, and then how many missions are basically using them, since the different colors represent a different mission, and then so that way you can kind of contextually like, okay, if I'm going to build an army and I wanted it to be good, I have to be able to play to this board state effectively. This is where you're going to be fighting. And for this GHB, the previous GHB, it kind of effectively meant like nothing. It literally meant nothing because it was the entire board. Like if you look at this, you're like, okay, well, what kind of corner or strategy should I pick? It didn't matter. It was the entire, almost everywhere on the board was relevant. Not necessarily by a specific mission, but the overall game was kind of spread across the entire board. You didn't have to think logistically about necessarily building for a specific type of archetype in the mission. Now we'll take a look at 2023, and you'll see there's kind of a pretty drastic change. So this is 2023 missions, and you'll notice now that while there is a relevancy of like the same kind of like spread out objectives, the actual sizable objectives are within that basically center square. It's if you can play to that center square, you're covering almost all of the missions. And then you'll notice there's still some, 4 missions that basically have these objectives kind of off the edges. But for the most part, like in terms of value to the game, all of the center square is almost as equally valuable as the outside base, or more valuable than the outside. So that's a pretty drastic change into mapping out like the GHB basically. That tells you that like you want to bring armies that can brawl. And that's the consensus, like, because you want armies to be able to send objectives towards the center of the table and basically duke it out of the opponent's army and get points and get value over the period of the game. It's no longer about basically being able to necessarily just maneuver on the edges and just basically nickel and dime little units. So you can use your little chaff unit to basically just take the objective at, having a little bit more power, a few more numbers and so forth and so forth. And now with Expert Conquer going away, it's a lot harder for those chaff units to kind of just sneak into taking away points without zero investment in shooting or melee to take it away from your opponent. So in that regard, like that's a pretty paradigm shift in terms of how the games are going to be played from an objective primary control standpoint. You no longer have to just necessarily be fast with chaff and just basically teleport across the table because the missions are all wide-ranging on that center board. Now they're just basically located in that fairly, fat center square. And then like when we take a look like at these paradigms, or the ones that are on the outside, like so Hours for the Taking. So Hours for the Taking, like it has 2 objectives off to the sides. And the deployment zone are basically almost near touching like L-shaped one. But the most valuable objective in general for both players is the center one. So even though those are valuable, you get more points for taking your opponent's one, but you also get less points for owning your own than effectively the center one. So it's kind of a wash for both players. The center one is all that matters the most. And when we look at the Realmstone Cache, which is in both GHB, the center one is almost as valuable as the outer ones because you want to fight over the center one early in the game to get the max points and prevent your opponent from scoring primary points, right? Because the idea here is that if you hold the center one, you get 1 and you get more than your opponent. And if you can stop your opponent from holding it, that's a 2-point differential for the first 2 turns, which ends up becoming a 4-point differential for the rest of the game. And that can, basically decide the winner right there. This is why, for a brief period of time, the Giants were so terrifying if you play them against that mission, because like, how can you bring enough bodies to take the center objective away from Giants for the first 2 turns? And it was basically borderline impossible. So you had to basically be able to kill them fast enough in the first 2 turns to prevent them from scoring the other objectives. Now, granted, there was Proving Point, which allowed you to prevent Giants necessarily by going second to take that objective for 1 turn, but that's gone. So in this Realmstone Cache format, like Giants are even more terrifying in a sense from an early point lead perspective. So that's a big change to the game. The other mission is Position over Power. Let's see. And that one is the side objectives are valuable, but they only exist for the first half of the game, well, for the first 2 turns. And then the next 3 turns, second half of the game, the center objectives are, basically more important. They're the only ones you can score. So in a relative sense, while you can get an early point lead from the first side ones, because they go away, your center objectives becomes just as valuable as the first one. So once again, like you're kind of fighting in this box here. And then finally, the last one is Twists and Turns, which is the most confusing one. So twists and turns, the way I try to calculate that one in terms of value is a bit strange because it's random how you basically, an objective gets activated effectively. It's a roll dice on a 4-up, it becomes activated. You get +1 of the dice roll if you have a Galatian champion basically contesting that objective. But the thing about, like, when you think about how you want to fight that mission, you can score the edge ones, but to invest a Galatian veteran unit, Galatian champion unit on that side edge one, to basically say gamble on the roll to take it away, is also problematic because you can only really challenge from that position one other objective with that Galatian champion, versus the center one, you can challenge the 2 side ones with that Galatian champion. So in terms of like which one gets activated, you're more likely to basically position for the center because you have 2 chances of technically 3 chances of them activating, versus because you have this one, that center one, and that one, versus the corner ones. If you try to position for corners, you really only have corners and then these 2. So unless you're going to do a 2-prong game, which is you're fighting on both side ones, where you're trying to, basically win out on the, potentially winning 4 rolls for activating objectives, versus just basically duking it on the center. I guess there is like more risk involved. So it just kind of, for me, feels like the center objectives in this mission are way more rewarding than the edge one, right? Effectively, that's how I conceptualize it. But for the most part, this one's kind of hard to score because it's completely kind of random if you can score these objectives or not. So going back to that previous view, like from this GHB to this GHB, it's a pretty impactful change. Not to mention the other things are, which basically once again will have an impact. Expert Conqueror is gone. Bounty Hunters are gone. Those mechanics will basically, which was kind of like ability to just kind of blow up units off objectives, or just basically walk into objective at 0 interaction wise with your opponent, is now gone. So it forces once again the game into more of a brawl like meta, because you can't just like, oh cool, you have 10 Herf. No, we'll use Fire Slice because that's my thing. 10 Herf guards on an objective. I can't just walk in my unit of 5 Battleline whatever because you left me enough space to squeeze in like 5 models into it and just take the objective without engaging with you at all. In this case, like, okay, I'm sorry, those 5 models, they can't do that. They have to you have to kill like at least 6 Herf guard Berserkers on the objective to take it away from me. Or like you have to deal with the Galatian champion mechanic in some missions to basically take it away. All of a sudden the game revolves more around like actually brawling it out versus just kind of playing this kind of like, peekaboo style play, where it's just like, I poke you here, but I really like, I'm positioned over there, and like I'm trying to be everywhere at once to basically prevent you from being able to concentrate your forces anywhere, but also scoring points at the same time, and so forth. And with the change also to battle tactics, it makes it more relevant for armies which are able to, not necessarily as killy required, because a lot of those new battle tactics are around position of Galatian champions onto objectives. So like the new version of Against the Odds is, I believe, I forgot the name off the top of my head, but it's having a Galatian unit that's out of 3 inches away, who starts the turn 3 inches away from enemy units, and onto an objective wholly outside of your territory, more than 3 inches away from an enemy unit as well. Sorry if you can hear my dogs barking in the background. That's she's just she's just noticed a stranger somewhere. Sorry about that. So for the most part, there is a significant paradigm shift between this GHB and that GHB. And now, what does that do about shooting? And this is where it gets a little bit funky to talk about, because this is purely my opinion on the state of shooting, but it is like it will basically be a significant change to the game. Shooting is probably going to go away as we know it. It is no longer going to be a relevant, style of gameplay. It will be, if you see shooting on the table, it is going to be because there are units which are good at shooting things specifically, and they're purpose built, but you won't see like necessarily shooting armies on the table. And when I mean like traditional shooting armies, I'm talking about like teleporting shooting like KO, or in some cases Seraphon or Stormcast, which are committed entirely to the shooting gimmick, or even Skaven with the 9 Stormfiend build. They're just literally now going to be more about, I need to bring shooting elements to remove certain opponent pieces, but like I still need like units to brawl it out on these objectives. So some shooting armies like KO, who can't really brawl it out on objectives, are going to be super punished. It comes down to multiple factors why I say this. One of them is the way this GHB rewards going second the most. Having bottom of the turn is a huge advantage in certain missions. For example, I think it's Jaws of Gallet. If you go second, you get to destroy. If you're bottom of turn, you get to destroy an objective on the table. That's a huge control element. And shooting, if you're removing pieces of ways for them to score on the board, it forces them more into the game plan of like, I have to literally kill you. And it gets like, shooting gets really benefited from like forcing armies to spread apart to score multiple objectives, allowing them to pick off certain sides and then take points. But once you're basically forcing the shooting armies to fight over a more congested area, and those armies no longer have to spread as much, it's much more problematic for shooting to score. The other part about going bottom of the turn is that shooting armies don't want to go bottom of the turn because they don't. Sorry, I should reset. Shooting armies would like to have bottom of the turn because on the first turn, because they want to avoid being double turned. But keeping that consistency is challenging. So in this format, it's more likely than not that you're going to effectively be forced to play, like if you're building a shooting army, you're probably going to want to take sharpshooter, which I think is a trap because it makes you 4-drops. While other armies don't really need to take sharpshooter, they can just say, screw it, I'll just be lower drop. So then, okay, you're losing sharpshooter mechanic because now you can't invest in sharpshooter, which means you can't really shoot JCs, which means this preventing your opponent's ability to score battle tactics JC. Well, you just no longer have that. So that's a significant change to the game, because shooting was about removing key pieces and then basically chipping and diming those units or scoring points, or like basically removing units that are already damaged or small from other points, so you can use your reserve units to sit on top of them or summon something on there. Going second also like has this weird ramification of basically having these extra heroic actions, which most shooting armies don't really use or benefit from, because outside of doing heroic willpower and an extra command point or maybe finest hour and something else, like they're not really benefiting from opening the gap and so forth. They usually don't have melee JC Galatian champions to benefit from that, so they're not really designed to do around that. And finally, like if shooting armies are not low drop because they're trying to take sharpshooter, and I think I've kind of indicated that earlier, there is the possibility that your opponent is going to basically know that like I need to go second, or my shooting opponent needs to go second next turn to prevent the ability for me to destroy objectives or whatever reason from benefiting from the second ability, or like taking extra battle technique and so forth. So they're going to be in a situation where like if your opponent who's facing you as a shooting player decides to go second at the start of the game, you're like, shit, I also don't want to avoid a double turn situation, right? So if your opponent's smart, he's basically going to pressure the board as fast as possible with his army and say, cool, no matter what you win on the initiative roll, you have a shitty option, because either you make me go first so you can control that initiative kind of, or that mission design thing, or you have to give me a double. Shooting armies don't want to face doubles, so it's kind of forcing them into this kind of like corral situation, like how the hell do I control this game without basically sacrificing all my resources? And this is why I think like most average shooting army players are going to struggle with this entire edition, and I think you're going to see them basically not necessarily disappear, but you're going to see a lot less of them because the game no longer incentivizes shooting as much as it used to, right? Because a lot of we lost some kill battle tactics, and then also like a lot of the new battle tactics from the GHB don't really benefit shooting armies at all. So once again, they're another incentive, the non-incentive for shooting armies. The whole turn order sequencing really punishes shooting armies, and the missions now are designed to fight on this center square, which shooting armies don't want to do because armies, basically opponent's army, can castle up and fight the rest of the game in this block and not necessarily have to care about these edges. And it's really hard for basically even like KO, which is kind of this extreme pick off a flank and just destroy it with your 2,000 points of shooting. Like, it's in some matchups that's fairly hard to do consistently, and having to face the reality that if you don't do it the first go around, you might not have the double turn as an option, because that double turn could cost you the game by taking it, because you no longer have the ability to necessarily score points because your opponent's smart enough to either outscore you or prevent you your ways of scoring, and so forth and so forth. So it's unlikely though shooting will go away entirely, but it's definitely hurt a lot by this GHB change. For the second half of this show, I was going to talk a little bit about KO and some KO list I'm thinking about bringing and testing for this GHB, because like I said, while I think shooting in the traditional sense is going away, I don't necessarily think shooting armies that KO necessarily have to, it's not impossible for them to adapt, but it is a lot harder. So we're going to go right into that in a few minutes while I go freshen up on some coffee. All right. All right, thanks for waiting, guys. Now that I'm back, let's go jump straight into talking about this type of shooting army for KO. And I'll talk about shooting, other traditional shooting armies and how they can better evolve into the game. So, as I discussed earlier, a lot of the problems is the incentives of the mission design and how the missions are, where they're being played and how they're being played. The game requires a change in philosophy how shooting happens, because most of the time shooting, and this is true for most armies, you wanted to be able to control who goes first to avoid being doubled, but the mission design also kind of forces if you want to be able to remove key pieces, you have to sacrifice 3 drops, because you have to take 3 units in the sharpshooter battalion. You don't have a choice of 1 to 3, you just have to take 3, which already makes you the lowest amount of drops, either 3 somehow, which is impossible, or 4 with a battle regiment. And then the rest of the other reason too is that you want to avoid, you want to go second first turn, but also for the second turn you kind of want to go second again. So from that perspective on, you have to kind of play the mission without the ability to take necessarily a double turn, unless you can be sure you can guarantee the coup de grace of the opponent's army through shooting. But in this case, this KO list, for the most part, is kind of a reimagining of how you can still bring a shooting army that has a lot of board presence and can kind of fight in the center objectives if you need to. And since it's KO, it's also trying to bring an army that can function on the basically Galatian champion battle tactics, as well as mission design and so forth. So right out of the gate, you'll notice that this is a Barak Zon army, which means that most people have no idea what Barak Zon is, because you almost never see it on the table. But Barak Zon is a sub-allegiance that gives all the Skyfarer units, which basically everything but the boats, if I remember correctly, +1 to hit if they make a charge during that turn. But if they're Sky Wardens and they make a charge, they also get +1 to wound. So you'll notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units of 3 Sky Wardens. Cool thing about Sky Wardens, they're very cheap now. They're 100 points for 3 models. So 6 wounds, 4 up, save, 100 points. They can take a special gun, and they can also take a volley gun. So now you have basically, a small MSU kind of mobile shooting unit that can also sometimes punch things. Not really hard, but at least they can. And the nice value of them is that they punish, in a sense, things that charge them. They can do mortal wounds to units that basically charge them. They have a mechanic where they can rolls dice based on the number of models in the enemy unit, and then on 6s, they do a mortal wound to them. They can also do a mortal wound by retreating away from enemy units. There's some restrictions, and I can't remember off the top of my head all of them, but basically, like, it's just they're a cheap Battleline unit, and they play well in Barak Zon, and it's just like trying to diversify as many shooting threats and as many small investment you can make. So like the idea is to like basically be able to sacrifice a 100-point unit to an objective and have your rest army basically wipe out whatever is on that objective, hopefully, and then take it away and take it. And then still, in some cases where you have to engage and you have to move into combat, you still have some like hitting power. The hitting power doesn't really come from the Sky Wardens. It comes from the rest of the list. It comes from the fact that the Admiral in the list, which you take for removing a ward save from an enemy unit, because that's really the how to really make sure your army can function against some armies is having an Admiral around. While he did go up in points, like it's still really good. And now with this sub-allegiance, he gets an artifact that gives him +2 attacks. So his hammer goes from 2 attacks to 5 attacks. And it's a pretty scary hammer. It's, 3s and 2s, rend 2, 3 flat damage. And if it's against a monster or hero, he gets +1 hit. So most of the time he's going to be, like, the things he's going to want to target are going to be 2s and 2s, rend 2, 3 flat damage, 5 attacks. He's pretty beat sticky. And he can pass on wounds to Skyfarer units like around him, which have, kind of bodyguard. The gimmick here is you basically have a clown card, and that's a gun hauler that has the mount trait of allowing you to put 5 models into it. So you can put the Admiral, the Navigator, and the 3 Endrinmasters, if you want, into it. And then now you have this really weird, like, melee death ball unit, because every one of the Endrinmasters has a weapon that gives him is 3 attacks, 3s and 3s, rend 1, 2 damage, but any 6s to hit does more wounds. So that's 9 attacks, more wounds, and that basically fly around there. That's a little gun hauler. With the Admiral, also has a pretty melee beat stick thing. And finally, you have the Navigator in there with them, because you're trying to reduce the movement speed of like things like big scary fly units, and you can access the Navigator Illuminator pistol, which allows you for once per game use it, and if it hits your target, your entire army gets to reroll to hit against that unit, which is super important when you have such an MSU based like list. Like, so that one turn you're like, cool, I'm gonna turn off the ward if I can, because there's 2 up, it's not guaranteed, and I can give myself my entire army a reroll to hit against that unit, just to hope you wipe it out. Now, to get all the balloon guys that we just discussed as Battleline, you have to take an Endrinmaster and the Dirigible Suit, which is a floaty boy leader. And you basically, I personally like making him the general, because the Barak Zon mechanic command trait has the ability for him to respawn to life if he dies with Deepening, which is kind of like the other aspect of the champion mechanic that works. So it gives him a little sticky. He's a pretty decent amount of wounds, so he's a fairly sticky Galatian champion. He also gets a 5-up ward because I give him the Gryph-feather charm artifact from the GHB. And finally, he is stubborn as a Rhinox, which makes him a 10 model count on objective as long as there's no Galatian champion near it or also contesting it. So that makes him like, that's the way KO now can play some of the Galatian mechanics. The nice thing too is that he can be teleported with the gun hauler sky high. So there's 2 gun haulers in the list, and the reason is so that way you can kind of split your delivery of champions around, and the one of them will carry the clown car, or you can call it the clown car. One of them will basically carry the Endrinmaster and the Dirigible Suit, and both of them can also bring with them the 6 Endrinriggers, the 2 blocks of 6 Endrinriggers in the list, with which are equipped with drill launchers and volley guns as well. I really like drill launchers. I usually run them on my gun haulers, with my traditional KO list, mostly because it's the random mortal wound trigger on, the nice thing about the gun hauler is if it's on a 5 or 6, it's hit or modified hit roll, it's just 3 flat mortal wound, which is super nice in some cases, just to pick off random like support heroes or just finish off units. It's made a difference, like against Morathi, just having here you go, take 3 mortal wounds, like cool, like don't have to worry about shooting any more resources, or it's just very convenient. The smaller ones kind of do the same thing, but they only trigger off 6s to hit instead of 5s. Granted, like now you have 4 of them versus 2, so in my list, which is basically the same statistical odds. but it also it's the only unit you can take that with to make it basically a sharpshooter, because I believe sharpshooter requires them to be Battleline, which is I think as the infantry keyword requirement. So now you basically have two of them are sharpshooters, and I have one of the third Sky Warden in units is another sharpshooter, just because randomness. Like I just we need three, so whatever. And then everything else is in basically warlord battalions to get like the extra artifacts. So I'm rocking 3 artifacts. The downside of this army is that it's like 15 drops, meaning you're rarely ever going to get to choose who goes first. But that's okay, because we just talked about how most of the time going first means that you want to go second, but then in turn 2 you're going to want to go second again. In this situation, the idea here is that like your opponent's going to make you go first, so you're going to have to basically play kind of cagey, and since most of this army is 24-inch range shooting, you're just basically plinking away at 24 inches, positioning yourself, getting points with your MSU sacrificial lamb units, blockading reserve all this MSU blocks, and then just basically like, cool, that's it. Like I got guns, I got 24-inch range, I got mobile MSU, and I don't want to be double turned. So you take very little risk in the board state in terms of point investment, and you can kind of block your opponent's ability to move upfield. So even if you do get doubled, you're not in a shitty position. But at the same time, most opponents are going to make you go first. So it means you have top of priority for turn 2, which means you're trying to go second anyway, turn 2. So you're going to want to be facing a double turn anyway, most of the time. And you just have to accept that's the reality of the table. If a smart opponent plays this list, they're going to want to basically reverse that mechanism typically. And I say smart, but and I'm walking through it myself right now as I'm speaking it, and I'm thinking like, is it smart? I don't even know for sure. So let's reverse that into the sequencing. Like your opponent gets to choose who goes first. He makes you go second, so he goes first, gets on the points, and just says, cool, like, can you take the points away from me? Probably not all of them. You can definitely take, maybe one, maybe if you're lucky, 2 points, but just having 1 or 2 units of Sky Warden upfield, and then shooting the rest of the army off him, and then just, cool, like working as intended. And then that way, the reason he's doing that is so he can choose to go second, because he has a higher probability of winning the priority roll, and then thus, in that case, means that you would get a double turn. And while you lose some scoring mechanism, you can still fully take advantage of the double turn, because once again, your army's functioning at this like 24-inch range shooting ability, so with a fairly fast crew, and the cool thing about the gun hauler being this kind of effectively clown car, unless your opponent can kill the gun hauler straight up in shooting, you will heal it back up to full every hero phase, because all your Endrinmasters heal at D3, so it's 3D3 heal. On top of that, if you have 6 Endrinriggers next to him, they can heal it as well. So the odds are the gun hauler, unless they can kill it straight up, which is, it's not impossible. It's not that hard, but in a shooting pairing, but it is incredibly challenging for more melee armies to, effectively do that at random. You'll just heal it back up to full. And the reason I say that, it's kind of hilarious, because it can move 18 once per game. Because it gets a 12-inch move, and once per game can add a 6-inch movement to it. And so all of a sudden, you have an 18-inch range, like clown car mechanic. And if you go really crazy with the Navigator, you can use this specific Navigator triumph to add another D6 inches of movement to it. So all of a sudden, this thing is moving 18 plus D6. It's fucking fast. So you're going to be able to, like, kind of like clown punch something that they don't expect it in the backfield of this gun hauler. The downside, is the characters inside don't benefit from the Barak Zon mechanic of the boat mixer charge, because they don't count as charging. But it is kind of like, who cares? Like, point is you're just having like such this weird kind of like mechanic of, basically having this ICBM of melee for KO with very low point investment. Like, it is a lot of characters. And it's kind of like this one basket situation, but I think it's fine, like, because that's not the strength of the list. The strength of the list is all the other MSU shooting that's in it. The advantage also, it gives you a bunch of Galatian champion units you can use to score points with, because you can drop off like the Endrinmaster and Navigator here and there, where you can use them to score missions, the more Galatian specific missions. When we're playing mostly the boat heavy army, I kind of like it was kind of designed to keep the characters inside the boats because they needed to provide unleash hell to the boats because the boats are not elite. But in this case, it doesn't really matter. The boats are kind of not going to take unleash hell anyway, but the units are going to benefit from it, and they can give themselves command points. So it's like, who cares in a sense? I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I don't know if a lot of people own this many balloon boys because it is. Let's see. With the Endrinmaster and Dirigible Suit, 1, then 12 Endrinriggers, so 13, and then I said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 18 more Sky Warden, so 18, 30, 31 Balloon Boys, and then 2 Gun Haulers and 5 characters. I think it'd be a lot of fun. It's a decent amount of wounds, 109. The Galatian units are pretty. The Galatian champions are some actually pretty decent ones. They're pretty high, sizable saves. Like the Endrinriggers are 4-up save. The Animals are 3-up save, but he can pawn off wounds to the Endrinriggers. The Endrinmaster of Dirigible Suit is a 3-up save with a 5-up ward. Like so, and they're all pretty fighty for we talked about this in the last video. There's not a lot of armies that have like kind of fighty Galatian champion units. And surprisingly, all the KO ones we're taking in this outside of the Navigator are pretty okay fighty. So, like we talked about, if you basically go, you charge your gun hauler into something with all your characters, and you're like, your opponent decides to, take the turn, whatever it's your opponent's turn, you do the heroic action. The Admiral. There's not that many good heroic actions for KO anyway, so you can effectively swing in your opponent's hero phase with one of your fucking 5 characters, right? So. It's like, I think it will be pretty fun. To pivot from KO and talking more about like other shooting lists, it's probably what you're gonna start seeing is some of the shooting lists that probably isn't impacted as much in the format is Seraphon. Seraphon. When are you ever bad? It's not that Seraphon are necessarily the greatest in terms of shooting because their shooting armies were always about quality over quantity. And unless you went full skink spam, but the thing is like in this current edition, like you're gonna need to see them invest in more like of their source leader characters, less into just the skink priest. Not that the skink priest are necessarily easy to remove from shooting because of the new mechanic, but it's also at the same time they're gonna need something that actually wants to move forward with their line to take some of these more like benefit from these Galatian mechanics. So you're gonna see a few source warrior heroes here and there, I would imagine. You probably, I don't know if we'll still see Thunder Lizard as much. I would imagine it became better, but with the fact that like you don't see, there's no more Expert Conqueror on the table, so their monsters are sizably different. More board heavy. They're more power to the board. In terms of scoring, but they did lose themselves Expert Conqueror. Bounty Hunter never really hurt Thunder Lizard that much because they were, most of their monsters are not Battleline, only the Skinks and the random unit of Source Warriors they summon. But for the most part, like they don't also like their current traditional list needs to divert some points away from their Skink Priest like support pieces to more like single Galatian unit that can do things on the table. I think you're more likely to see Starborn armies because you're going to want to be able to not just teleport, which is still really good, from Bizeko shooting, but also having like those additional ability to summon things on the table. And like I said, the mission's designed now to be so congested,ly in the middle, and it's more going back to a brawler heavy game. So either you go for attrition through Starborn mechanic and to try to shield block or bubble wrap with like summon units, or you're going to have to effectively depend on, if you're playing Thunder Lizard, and on the fact that like you might have to take more melee specific units with JCs. So you're going to go a little bit more away from shooting. Not that Salamanders are fantastic. You'll probably still see them around, but because they can do that job of shooting plus melee combat. But I think in terms of like support pieces that make those armies super good at shooting, you're going to see them having to sacrifice some point of investment away from that to be able to score these missions effectively. So that's Seraphon, the impact to them. I think you'll see in the next year or so. In terms of shooting, Cities of Sigmar list are probably not as impacted as the other shooting list because much like this list, it's traditionally what they would take is a lot of MSU shooting with like buff pieces that would render them more effective in shooting with some kind of flanking or side centerpiece like 10 protectors or fulminators outflanking to do basically through living cities to pick off the size. So in a sense, that army hasn't been affected too much with the shooting restriction that the mission designers are played. I think they'll probably come out fine, but at the same time, Dawnbringer is around the corner, and who knows what the hell that's going to look like for basically cities. Because if I remember correctly, almost all of the Empire line is going away in Dawnbringer. That was a rumor. So if that's true, like all the crossbowmen and musketmen are going away, and the only thing left is like Iron Drakes. Cool for me because I have this giant collection of old dwarf that I'm looking forward to building for either when the new dwarf book comes out or the new cities or Dawnbringer Crusade book comes out. In terms of other shooting armies that's around, we talked about KO, Seraphon, cities. We can talk a little bit about Stormcast. Stormcast, I never really considered them a true shooting army in the sense that, long strikes are shooting, Judicators are shooting, but it's not what defines the army. It's just a combination of like you have a good core and then like things that can score points and have some melee. So they'll probably be fine in the decision. They were never truly a shooting army only. They were just an army that has effective things at shooting for specific targets and then like some all-over encompassing. The problem with Stormcast is it suffers a lot from the current like power creep. They haven't really caught up with it. Their point adjustments, while it keeps going down, isn't really going down in places of shooting, which is great. But it also kind of like Stormcast can just do brawler much better than they can do shooting. So why invest in shooting when the meta is around brawling? And they have a lot of Galatian veteran, Galatian champion units that can, are pretty okay. So it seems like, once again, the incentive is to just not play shooting for Stormcast if you can avoid it. You can still take shooting units. You're just like, there's no reason to like over dedicate yourself to it. And then we had, Morathi and her favorite band, the Bow Snakes. She's once again probably isn't going away. The problem is that list was so point heavy into these Morathi Kane plus the Bow Snakes that you didn't really have much Galatian champion. You didn't have a lot of units on the board, and it didn't play brawler very well. So in this case, like it's gonna get even worse in this current format because they need to really consider like, do we keep Morathi or do we drop Morathi and just lose the double shooting? And then all of a sudden it's like, well, if we don't have the double shooting, do we still need the Bow Snakes? And then slowly in a way, you'll find out like, hey, guess what? You know what Doc does really well is a brawler type game. Why invest into shooting? If shooting, like, when it comes down to this thing where it's like, these armies just do this things better than shooting, so why involve yourself into it? And then Luminef, which already took the massive changes to and nerf to effectively their Sentinel, like, and the Foxes don't play control, they don't move in your opponent's sphere of movement phase anymore, so you're just basically, yeah, who's going to bring Luminef shooting? I mean, no one. It was already dying, so it's especially now it's even worse now. So you're probably not going to see them as much as often. You'll probably see variations of it, and I have another video in the works where I'm going to talk about the type of Luminef list I would want to see in the GHB or in this season effectively. Finally, we have Ogres with the new, basically giant cannon artillery chariot piece, which I can never remember, the Iron Blasters, I think they were called. They got point upgraded. They got point increase, sorry. And honestly, it's the same thing. Like the army with Frost Lords and Iron Gods and so forth just does the brawler game so much better than it does the shooting game. And you have like cheap screen units that are fantastic at scoring objectives. Like, why play the shooting game when you can just play the brawler game? It's you tell me, well, it's because like I do shooting well and I want to counter the brawler meta. I'm like, I'm not sure that counters it at all. And like the kind of like the ascendancy of Slaves of Darkness is just like going to make, like, unless you're bringing like consistent Ren 3 shooting, I think like you're gonna have a hard time chewing through like Slaves of Darkness armies for basically that. And that's the same problem KO is gonna face. Like, how the hell are we gonna deal with like the Vanguard blocks of moving upfield? And you just, because they have ward saves against your mortal wounds if the few you have, and the volume of shooting is mostly Ren 1. And at best you could make them Ren 2 with the Admiral if you choose a special ammo, but still that's maybe not enough to go through. So it is the great question, as like, can shooting survive the ascendancy of Slaves of Darkness, which is incredibly elite, fast, save stacking army, or decent save, effectively. I don't know, it's with the way the missions are shaping up, the battle tactics are shaping up, the way priority needs to be resolved. I don't see shooting performing like better. In fact, I see just performing worse than they did last the last book. For me, for KO, for example, like one of the big things I lost was, from a battle tactic perspective, losing the ability to have those easy kind of missions where I can just pick up an enemy unit and I get the point. Like the battle tactic, that's going away. Like it's becoming like much harder to score battle tactics with KO in this format, unless you with my older list. I think this list will be fine, but in my old list would not adapt very well. And this new list plays so differently than my old list because it's way more static than the old list, and it's just you're basically dependent on not being efficient at like blocking your enemy unit and just sacrificing like 200 to 300 points a turn, because that's really the only way you're going to be able to like prevent like engagements correctly. There's a word to be said about, like I mentioned in the last video, like having just like after playing that Lofnir list with all the Brimrath and Gotrek, like just on these missions, it's just so rewarding for that type of army. Just basically sitting up middle and just basically telling your opponent, like, if you can't table me by turn 4, like you probably, and you can't fight me on these objectives, you're probably going to lose the game like before we have a full completion. So it's so shooting is usually that is an archetype that wants to win, like lose early to recoup the differentials later, because it just removes so many pieces of your opponent's army to score. But you also have to be able to get on the points on turn 3, and having this like weird way where some of these missions reward more of these like early point lead advantages by giving bonus points for maybe objectives that disappear, or having the ability to score 2 battle tactics if you have a Galatian champion on top of an objective. Makes it like hard for these kind of shooting armies which are trying to not engage melee wise upfield in the first half of the game, and really only the first 2 turns, and then all of a sudden like they have to make this huge differential point gap for the later half of the game. And unless you have very good book tactics that really reward that kind of like more like kill things strategy in the beginning, it's going to be hard for those armies to achieve that. Like I said, like losing Expert Conqueror is so crippling in some cases for those armies that it becomes challenging to get those primary points early, and then also have the ability to take objectives away to score those battle tactics. So we will see. I just think it's not the greatest like meta for shooting, which is usually a good thing for the rest of the game. And I think the shooting armies we'll see that perform well are going to be very different than the current meta state we used to see for shooting. So thanks for watching. That's all I'm going to cover today. And I'm looking forward to probably release a video next this early midweek regarding basically Soulblight, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to deploy that Fireslayer Lofnir list in the first half. But then I want to go over kind of a cool Soulblight list concept I think is going to be good for this GHB. And I'm going to continue making content about like what I think will be good, cool armies that work in this new meta. Thanks for watching, and I hope I would tell you to subscribe and everything, but I don't even know if I've subscribed to anybody on this channel. I'm just looking forward to once again, this is purely me being selfishly trying to create more content, so it's as my New Year's resolution, and working on my speech and getting more approachable for the community. And then so people can also take some good knowledge from me. I get asked a lot of questions, and most of these topics are related to people's questions that I get asked privately about the game and the changes. So I'm just trying to take them to more of a broad audience. All right, guys, have a lovely rest of your day.